The dirty boy stepped into the marble lobby, asking to check his balance. Seconds later, the millionaire who mocked him was staring at the screen in absolute shock. The winter sun barely touched the downtown skyline that January morning, casting long shadows across glass towers that pierced the sky like monuments to human ambition. Inside the headquarters of Hale Financial Group, the temperature held steady at 68 degrees, precisely controlled, untouchable, perfect. Everything about this building screamed dominance. The marble floors were imported from Carrara, Italy, the same quarries Michelangelo used. The 30-foot ceilings were trimmed in what looked like gold leaf, but was actually genuine 24-karat gold. The air carried the scent of leather, bergamot, and something else harder to name. Success, perhaps, or the absence of struggle. This was Jonathan Hale's cathedral. At 52 years old, Jonathan had built his empire on a philosophy as cold as the January wind outside. Weakness is a choice. Poverty is proof of failure. Money is the only language that matters. He'd clawed his way up from a middle-class childhood in Ohio, fought through state school, worked 100-hour weeks, and emerged victorious. His tailored suit fit like armor. His Swiss timepiece caught the light with every gesture, a reminder to everyone in the room that time itself bent to his will. His corner office overlooked the city like a king surveying his kingdom. People feared him. Employees walked on eggshells around him. Competitors studied him. The media called him a genius. But if you looked closely at Jonathan Hale, past the expensive watch and perfect smile, past the confident stride and commanding voice, you'd see something missing. Something hollow. A space where warmth should live, but didn't. Where peace should rest, but couldn't. Jonathan Hale was successful, but Jonathan Hale was empty. He just didn't know it yet. Outside, the city was waking up to a brutal cold snap that had frozen pipes and sent homeless shelters into crisis mode. The kind of cold that makes your lungs burn, the kind that turns your breath into clouds and your fingers numb in minutes. Eliam Brooks felt all of it. The 10-year-old trudged through gray slush that soaked through his worn sneakers, each step a small battle against exhaustion, hunger, and the voice in his head that kept whispering, "Turn back, you don't belong there, they'll laugh at you." His clothes hung loose on his small frame, 2 sizes too big, donated months ago, and worn thin from constant use. His jacket had a tear along the shoulder. His jeans were stained with dirt that wouldn't wash out no matter how hard he scrubbed. But clutched in his right hand, pressed against his chest like a shield, was a piece of paper, wrinkled, stained, folded and unfolded so many times the creases had worn soft. On that paper, in handwriting he'd memorized by heart, were the last words his mother had written before she died. Eliam didn't understand everything the words meant, but he understood enough. His mother had told him that, when things got desperate, when there was nowhere else to turn, he should go to the tall glass building downtown, the one with the golden letters. She'd told him not to be afraid, that God had already made a way. So despite the cold, despite the fear crawling up his spine, despite the 3 hours he'd spent standing across the street trying to gather courage, Eliam kept walking. Sometimes God sends answers dressed in suffering, hoping a hardened heart will finally see. The revolving door moved slowly, heavy as a vault. Eliam pushed against it with both hands, feeling the shift from brutal cold to manufactured warmth hit him like stepping into another dimension. And then he was inside. The lobby stretched out before him like something from a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Marble columns rose impossibly high, supporting a ceiling decorated with intricate molding and recessed lighting that cost more than most people earned in a year. Crystal chandeliers, each one a masterpiece of engineering and excess, cast soft light across leather furniture that looked too pristine to actually sit on. Everything gleamed. Everything sparkled. Everything whispered the same message over and over. You don't belong here. Eliam's sneakers squeaked against the polished floor, each step announcing his presence like an alarm. His reflection in the marble looked small, distorted, wrong. He could feel eyes turning toward him, conversations pausing mid-sentence, the entire energy of the room shifting. A junior associate glanced up from her tablet and froze, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering over the screen. A security guard near the entrance instinctively touched his radio, his training kicking in before his compassion could. A woman in a camel hair coat pulled her designer purse closer to her body, as if poverty were contagious. Eliam felt all of it. The stares, the whispers, the judgment, radiating from every corner of the room like heat from a furnace. His throat tightened. His hands trembled. The paper in his grip grew damp with sweat. But he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, toward the main desk, where a woman named Victoria sat behind a sleek glass counter, her expression perfectly composed until she saw what was approaching her. Then her composure cracked. Just a little. Victoria had worked at Hale Financial Group for 6 years. In that time, she'd learned to read people in seconds. Clients who had money versus clients who pretended to have money. Investors who were serious versus investors who were wasting her time. She prided herself on her ability to filter, to gatekeep, to maintain the standards that made Hale Financial Group what it was. Elite, exclusive, untouchable. And now, a child who looked like he'd been sleeping under a bridge was standing in front of her desk. "Can I help you?" Her voice was professional but cold, the kind of tone that suggested the answer should be no. Eliam swallowed hard. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "I need help." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose a fraction. "Sweetheart, I think maybe you have the wrong building. The Community Services Center is about 6 blocks that way." She gestured vaguely toward the door, dismissal already in her posture. "I have an account here." The words hung in the air like an impossible riddle. Victoria blinked. Twice. "I'm sorry, what?" Eliam reached into his jacket pocket with shaking fingers and pulled out a small laminated card. Scratched, worn at the edges, but unmistakable. The Hale Financial Group logo gleamed under the lobby lights. Victoria stared at the card like it had appeared out of thin air. She reached for it slowly, turned it over, examined it front and back. The magnetic stripe was worn but intact. The account number was visible. The logo was authentic. "Where did you get this?" Her voice had shifted from dismissive to confused. "My mom gave it to me." Eliam's words were simple, honest, devastating in their innocence. "She told me to come here when I needed to. She said I just needed to check my balance." That's when Jonathan Hale noticed the disturbance. He'd been standing near the elevator bank, reviewing quarterly reports on his phone, half listening to his chief operating officer ramble about client acquisition metrics. But something had changed in the lobby's energy. That carefully controlled hum of productivity had shifted into something else. Curiosity, confusion, judgment. Jonathan looked up and saw him, a boy. Tiny. Dirty. Standing at Victoria's desk like he'd wandered in from another century. Jonathan's first emotion wasn't sympathy. It was irritation. His polished shoes clicked against the marble as he strode across the lobby, his presence parting the crowd like a knife through water. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Everyone knew when Jonathan Hale was approaching, and everyone knew to get out of his way. "Victoria." His voice cut through the space with surgical precision. "Is there a reason we're allowing street children to wander through my building? I was under the impression we had protocols." Eliam turned. Their eyes met for the first time. Jonathan saw a poor kid. Unwashed, underfed, out of place. Eliam saw a man in a perfect suit with eyes as cold as the winter outside. Victoria stammered, her professional composure cracking under her boss's glare. "Sir, he says he has an account, but I was just about to." "An account?" Jonathan's laugh erupted before he could stop it. Sharp, cruel, echoing across the vaulted ceiling like a whip crack. "Look at him, Victoria. Look at his face. He's got dirt on his cheek and shoes that are literally falling apart. The only account this kid knows about is probably the one his mother uses at the dollar store." Scattered laughter rippled through the lobby like a disease. A businessman near the coffee bar smirked into his latte. A woman in pearls whispered something to her companion, both of them glancing at Eliam with barely concealed disgust. Even some of the staff, terrified of contradicting their boss, forced uncomfortable smiles. Eliam's fingers tightened around the crumpled paper in his hand, but he didn't cry. He'd learned long ago that tears didn't move people like this. That showing weakness only invited more cruelty. I just want to check my balance. His voice was quieter now but steady, unshakable. Jonathan stepped closer, looking down at the boy with the kind of pity that's really contempt, dressed up as concern. Kid, do you even understand what a balance is? This isn't a playground. This isn't a place for games. Go home. He turned to the security guard stationed by the entrance. Marcus, please escort our young friend back outside. Gently. Wait. Eliam held up the card with both hands now, like an offering or maybe a challenge. Please. Just check it. That's all I'm asking. Something flickered across Jonathan's face. Annoyance? Maybe. Or something deeper. Something he'd spent decades burying so far down he'd forgotten it existed. The boy's eyes were clear, fearless, unashamed, and that unsettled Jonathan more than he wanted to admit. He snatched the card from Eliam's small hands, glanced at it with barely concealed disdain, then scoffed. Fine. Let's end this little performance. He walked to the nearest terminal, Victoria trailing behind him nervously, the entire lobby watching in silence. Jonathan swiped the card with theatrical flair, like he was humoring a child's fantasy. He typed in the PIN that Eliam whispered, his smirk growing wider with every keystroke. The system loaded. The screen refreshed. Jonathan's smile was still plastered across his face, confident, superior, untouchable. And then the numbers appeared. Account holder: Eliam A. Brooks. Account type: trust fund. Restricted access until age 18. Current balance: $8,217,445.62. Jonathan's smile didn't fade gradually. It vanished, like someone had reached into his chest and yanked his soul out through his throat. His face went pale. His hands gripped the edge of the terminal. The room seemed to tilt sideways. What? The word came out strangled, barely human. Victoria gasped audibly behind him. Several lobby staff crowded closer, trying to see the screen, their expressions shifting from amusement to shock to disbelief. $8 million. In the account of a boy who looked like he hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. Jonathan turned slowly, his eyes finding Eliam's face like he was seeing him for the first time. Who are you? It wasn't really a question. It was an accusation. A plea. A desperate attempt to make reality make sense again. Eliam didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully unfolded the crumpled paper he'd been holding so tightly. His small fingers smoothed it out with reverence. The kind of care you give to sacred things. He held it up so Jonathan could see. The handwriting was shaky but beautiful, written in fading blue ink. Lord, I don't have much, but I trust you to multiply my little into more than enough for my son. Let his life be abundant where mine was lacking. Let him never know the hunger I've known. Let him see that you are faithful, even when the world is cruel. Amen. Naomi Brooks. Jonathan's hands trembled as he read the words. Once, twice, 3 times. That's my mom, Eliam said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence like a prayer. She passed away 3 months ago. But before she died, she told me, when I needed help, I should come here. She said you'd understand. Something cracked inside Jonathan's chest. Not his pride, though that shattered too. Something deeper. Something he'd locked away so long ago, he'd forgotten it existed. His soul. But before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, smash that like, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Have you ever been judged for how you looked? Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people who thought they were better than you? Tell me your story in the comments. Because what happens next in this story, it's going to shake you to your core. Jonathan stared at the screen. At the numbers. At the boy. At the prayer written in a dead woman's hand. His throat felt like it was closing. His eyes burned. His carefully constructed world, the empire he'd built on ambition and arrogance and the belief that money was the only thing that mattered, it was all crumbling. Your mother, Jonathan managed, his voice hoarse. Who was she? Her name was Naomi Brooks. Eliam spoke her name like it was holy. She cleaned houses, took care of old people, helped anyone who needed it. She didn't have much, but she always said God would provide. Jonathan felt like he was drowning, like the marble floor had opened up beneath him and he was falling into something vast and terrifying and unavoidable. She prayed for me every night, Eliam continued, his innocent eyes locked on Jonathan's face, even when she was sick. Even when we didn't have food. She told me, God sees everything, that nothing we do is hidden from him, that one day, the balance would be made right. The words hit Jonathan like hammer blows. The balance would be made right. He looked at the screen again. $8 million. Money the boy didn't even know he had. Money that had been sitting untouched while he walked through slush in broken shoes. And suddenly Jonathan understood. This wasn't about money. This was about a reckoning. Heaven had sent a messenger. Not an angel. Not a vision. A 10-year-old boy with dirt on his face and faith in his heart. And Jonathan Hale, the man who thought he'd conquered the world, was about to discover he'd been living in a cage the entire time. But to understand how a boy who looked like he had nothing came to possess more wealth than most people see in a lifetime, we have to go back. Back to a woman the world overlooked. A woman who prayed in secret, served in silence, and trusted God when everyone else would have given up. Her name was Naomi Brooks, and this is her story. The lobby had gone silent in that heavy way that follows shock. Jonathan stood frozen at the terminal, his hand still gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Around him, executives who'd been laughing moments ago now shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the screen, the boy, and their boss. Victoria broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. Sir, I don't understand. How is this possible? Jonathan didn't answer her. Couldn't answer her. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of numbers that shouldn't exist attached to a child who shouldn't be here. He turned to Eliam, who stood perfectly still, that crumpled prayer still held in his small hands like a talisman. Sit. Jonathan's voice came out rougher than he intended. He gestured to one of the leather chairs nearby. Sit down and explain this to me. Right now, Eliam moved slowly to the chair, his worn sneakers squeaking against the marble. He perched on the edge, looking impossibly small against the oversized furniture. The entire lobby watched him, dozens of eyes tracking his every movement. My mom saved for me, Eliam said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear Jonathan could see in his eyes. She told me God would provide. That's all I know. Jonathan pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency as he pulled up the bank's internal system. He needed to see the account history. Needed to understand how $8 million ended up in the name of a child whose mother apparently cleaned houses for a living. The transaction history loaded on his screen. His eyes scanned the dates, the amounts, the pattern that emerged. Small deposits, $20 here, $50 there, sometimes just 10, month after month, year after year. The kind of savings pattern you'd see from someone living paycheck to paycheck, setting aside whatever scraps they could manage. And then, 6 months ago, everything changed. One deposit. The source listed as estate of Samuel Whitford, transferred via trust executor. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. Samuel Whitford. He knew that name. Everyone in the financial district knew that name. Samuel Whitford had been a real estate magnate, a self-made millionaire who'd built his fortune in the post-war boom and never looked back. He died last year at age 93, and his estate had been the subject of intense speculation. No known heirs, no family. The will had been sealed, handled privately. Victoria, Jonathan said sharply, pull everything we have on the Whitford estate transfer. I want documentation. I want verification. I want to know how this money got into this account. Victoria hurried to her terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Jonathan turned back to Eliam. Samuel Whitford. Did you know him? Eliam shook his head. No, sir. But my mom did. She took care of him. Took care of him how? She was his nurse. For 5 years, I think. Maybe 6. She went to his house every day, made his meals, gave him his medicine, read to him. Eliam's voice softened with memory. She used to come home and tell me about him, said he was lonely, said most rich people are. The words landed like a punch to Jonathan's gut. Victoria's voice cut through the tension. Sir, I have the documentation. The transfer is legitimate. Estate of Samuel Whitford, executed through Patterson and Lee Law Firm. The trust was established specifically for. She paused, reading from her screen. The minor child of Naomi Elizabeth Brooks, to be held in trust until age 18 or in case of extreme need, as determined by the trustee. Jonathan felt the ground shifting beneath him. Who's the trustee? We are, sir. Hale Financial Group was designated as trustee by Mr. Whitford himself. The paperwork was filed 14 months ago, 4 months before his death. Jonathan's mind reeled. Samuel Whitford had trusted his bank with this inheritance, had chosen them specifically to protect it for a child he'd never met, the son of a woman who'd cared for him in his final years, and Jonathan hadn't even known it existed. Tell me about your mother, Jonathan said, his voice quieter now. He pulled up another chair and sat across from Eliam, ignoring the crowd of onlookers. Tell me who she was. Eliam's eyes brightened, despite the sadness lurking there. She was kind. Everyone said that about her. She worked a lot, took care of old people mostly. Sometimes she cleaned houses too. We didn't have much, but she always found ways to help other people. She'd give food to the neighbors when they needed it. She'd pray with people who were sick. She'd watch kids after school when their parents had to work late. Your father? He died when I was 3. Car accident. I don't really remember him. Jonathan felt something twisting in his chest. So she raised you alone? Yes, sir. Just the 2 of us. We lived in a small apartment on the east side. 1 bedroom. She gave me the bed. She slept on the couch. Eliam's voice wavered slightly. She never complained. Not once. Even when she got sick. Even when the cancer made her so tired she could barely stand. She'd still get up and go to work because she said people were depending on her. The lobby had gone completely silent. Jonathan could feel eyes on him. Could sense the shift in energy as his staff realized this wasn't just about money. This was about something far more profound. The paper you're holding, Jonathan said. What does it say? Eliam looked down at the crumpled prayer, his fingers smoothing it out with reverent care. He read it aloud. His young voice, clear and unwavering. Lord, I don't have much, but I trust you to multiply my little into more than enough for my son. Let his life be abundant where mine was lacking. Let him never know the hunger I've known. Let him see that you are faithful even when the world is cruel. Amen. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Jonathan felt something breaking inside him. A spiritual prick, sharp and undeniable, piercing through 30 years of carefully constructed defenses. He'd built his life on the belief that prayer was for weak people, that faith was a crutch for those who couldn't make it on their own, that the only thing that mattered in this world was what you could earn, control, possess, and here sat a boy who had nothing and everything, who'd been raised by a woman who'd had nothing and given everything, who'd trusted a God Jonathan had spent decades ignoring. Victoria's voice interrupted his thoughts. Sir, there's more in the file. A letter from Mr. Whitford. Addressed to, she paused, to the boy. To Eliam. Read it, Jonathan said. Victoria hesitated, then began. To Eliam Brooks. You will never remember me, but I will never forget your mother. Naomi came into my life when I had given up on humanity, when wealth had isolated me and age had made me bitter. She treated me with a dignity I didn't deserve and a kindness I'd never earned. She prayed for me when I cursed God. She fed me when I had no appetite for living. She held my hand when I was dying and told me it wasn't too late to make peace with my Creator. Because of her, I did. This money is not payment. You cannot pay someone for saving your soul. This is gratitude. This is my way of saying that your mother's faith was not wasted, that her prayers were heard, that her sacrifice mattered. Use it wisely. Use it as she would have. And remember that true wealth is never measured in dollars. It's measured in love. Samuel Whitford. The silence that followed was absolute. Jonathan stared at Eliam, at this small boy in worn clothes who carried the legacy of a mother who'd changed lives through simple acts of service. A woman who died with almost nothing in her bank account but had left her son with more than most people accumulated in a lifetime. Naomi Brooks had never touched the money, never spent a penny of it on herself, even when she was dying. She'd preserved it for her son's future, trusting that God would provide for her until her last breath. Jonathan felt shame wash over him like a wave. He'd laughed at this boy, mocked him, humiliated him in front of a room full of people, and the whole time, the boy had been carrying a fortune built on sacrifice and faith. "I'm sorry," Jonathan heard himself say. The words felt foreign in his mouth, rusty from disuse. "I shouldn't have laughed at you. I was wrong." Eliam looked at him with eyes far too old for his young face. "Mom used to say people laugh when they're scared. She said it's easier to mock than to understand." The wisdom in those words struck Jonathan like a physical blow. He felt judged. Not by the boy, not even by the ghost of Naomi Brooks, by God himself. Jonathan stood abruptly, his mind spinning. "I need air. Victoria, take care of him. Get him whatever he needs. Food, water, anything." He walked toward his private elevator, his legs unsteady beneath him. The crowd parted for him automatically, but their eyes followed him with questions he couldn't answer. That night, Jonathan barely slept. He tossed in his king-sized bed in his penthouse apartment, his mind replaying the day's events on an endless loop. The boy's face, the mother's prayer, the letter from a dying man who'd found redemption through a woman who cleaned his house and saved his soul. When sleep finally came, it brought something Jonathan hadn't experienced in decades. A dream, or maybe a vision. He stood in his bank lobby, but it was empty now, silent. And across the marble floor, bathed in soft light that had no visible source, stood a woman. She was small, thin, with kind eyes and worn hands. She wore simple clothes, a caregiver's uniform. Her smile was gentle, sad, knowing. Naomi Brooks. Jonathan knew it was her without being told. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at him with those eyes that seemed to see straight through him, past his expensive suit and watch, past his carefully constructed image, down into the hollow place where his soul should be. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but it filled the entire space. "Your wealth is your cage." Jonathan woke up gasping, his heart pounding, his sheets soaked with sweat. The words echoed in his mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. "Your wealth is your cage." And for the first time in 30 years, Jonathan Hale began to wonder if everything he'd built was actually a prison he'd locked himself inside. The dreams didn't stop. Night after night, Jonathan Hale lay awake in his penthouse, watching the city lights blur through exhausted eyes, dreading the moment sleep would come. Because when it did, she was always there. Naomi Brooks, standing in different places now, sometimes in his office, sometimes in the bank lobby. Once, she stood at the foot of his bed, her presence so real he woke up, calling out, his voice echoing through the empty apartment. By the third night, Jonathan looked like a different man. The sharp edges of his confidence had dulled. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His hands trembled when he reached for his morning coffee. Victoria noticed. His COO noticed. Even the security guard who greeted him each morning noticed the change. But no one dared ask. On the fourth night, the dream changed. Jonathan stood again in the empty lobby, and Naomi was there, closer this time. Close enough that he could see the weariness in her face, the kind that came from years of carrying burdens too heavy for one person. But her eyes were still gentle, still knowing. She reached out her hand, worn and calloused from a lifetime of service, and placed it over his heart. Her touch burned like fire and ice at once. "His faith is your key," she said. Her voice echoed through the marble hall, through his chest, through his soul. "His faith is your key." Jonathan woke up sobbing. He sat on the edge of his bed for an hour, his face in his hands, trying to understand what was happening to him. He was a rational man. A man of numbers and logic and provable facts. Dreams were just dreams. Stress responses, brain chemistry. But this felt like more than chemistry. This felt like judgment. When the sun finally rose, Jonathan made a decision that would change everything. He called his head of internal audit into his office before the markets even opened. Margaret Chen had worked for Hale Financial Group for 12 years. She was thorough, ruthless, and incorruptible. Exactly the kind of person you wanted digging through your company's operations when you suspected something was rotten beneath the polished surface. "I need you to audit every department," Jonathan said without preamble. "Lending, accounts, client services, everything." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "Sir, we just completed our annual audit 3 months ago. Everything was—" "I don't care what the annual audit said. I want you to look deeper. Look at our practices with low-income clients. Look at fee structures. Look at loan terms. Look at account closures." Jonathan's voice was hard, driven by something Margaret had never heard before. Desperation. "I want to know if we're hurting people." Margaret stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "Sir, are you feeling all right? Just do it, Margaret. And I want a report by end of week." She did it. What Margaret found made Jonathan physically ill. The report landed on his desk 5 days later. 237 pages of documentation, spreadsheets, and evidence of systematic exploitation that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Predatory loans targeting single mothers with interest rates that guaranteed they'd never escape debt. Hidden fees on low-balance accounts that drained what little savings poor families managed to accumulate. Automated account closures that left people without access to their own money, triggering cascading financial crises. Mortgage schemes that promised home ownership but were designed to end in foreclosure. And all of it was legal, technically, buried in fine print and user agreements that no one read and fewer understood. Jonathan read every page. With each new revelation, he saw his own reflection staring back at him. This was his bank, his leadership, his philosophy made manifest. Weakness is a choice. Poverty is proof of failure. If they can't read the contract, that's their problem. If they can't afford the fees, they shouldn't have accounts here. How many times had he said those exact words? How many lives had been destroyed while he collected his bonuses and smiled for the cameras? Jonathan locked his office door, closed the blinds, and, for the first time in more years than he could count, he broke down completely. He sat on the floor of his corner office, his back against the wall, and wept like a child. Great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. Not the controlled tears of grief at a funeral or the calculated emotion of a business negotiation. This was raw, unfiltered, the kind of crying that comes when you finally see yourself clearly and hate what you've become. He'd built an empire on the backs of people like Naomi Brooks. People who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't get ahead. People who trusted banks to help them, not exploit them. People who prayed over their children at night because prayer was all they had left. And he'd laughed at them, called them weak, called them failures, called them exactly what he'd become. 3 days later, Eliam came back to the bank. Victoria had called him in to complete some additional paperwork for the trust fund. Legal formalities, signatures, documentation that would ensure he could access funds for his basic needs while the bulk remained protected until he turned 18. Jonathan watched from his office as the boy entered the lobby. This time, no one laughed. No one whispered. Security had been given explicit instructions. Staff had been informed. Eliam Brooks was to be treated with the utmost respect and care. But Jonathan didn't want to watch from a distance. He came down to meet him. Eliam looked up as Jonathan approached, those clear, fearless eyes, meeting his without judgment or fear. Just openness. Simple trust. "Hello, Mr. Hale," Eliam said politely. "Hello, Eliam. Can we talk, privately?" They sat in a small conference room, just the two of them. Jonathan had coffee brought in. Hot chocolate for Eliam. Pastries that the boy ate with the careful gratitude of someone who didn't take food for granted. "I've been thinking about your mother," Jonathan said carefully. "About what she must have been like." Eliam's face brightened. "She was wonderful. She always saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it." The words hit Jonathan like an arrow. "Did she?" Jonathan paused, unsure how to ask. "Did she ever talk about people like me? People with money?" Eliam nodded, swallowing a bite of pastry. "She used to say rich people were the loneliest. That money built walls instead of bridges. She prayed for people like you all the time." Jonathan's throat tightened. "She prayed for me? She didn't even know me. She didn't need to know your name to pray for you. She'd see your building from the bus, see people in suits walking in and out, and she'd pray that God would soften their hearts, that they'd remember what really matters before it was too late." Eliam looked at Jonathan with those ancient eyes. "She prayed for you even when she was dying, Mr. Hale. She had a whole list of people she prayed for. You were on it." The room spun. Jonathan gripped the edge of the table. "I don't understand. I humiliated you. I laughed at you. I was cruel to you in front of everyone. Why would she pray for someone like me? Because Mom said people only change when love reaches them. And prayer is how love travels." The simplicity of it shattered Jonathan completely. He put his face in his hands and wept in front of this 10-year-old boy who'd seen more hardship than Jonathan had ever known. Wept for the life he'd wasted, for the people he'd hurt, for the soul he'd nearly lost in pursuit of money that meant nothing. "I'm sorry," Jonathan choked out between sobs. "I'm so sorry. For how I treated you. For what my bank has done to people like your mother. For all of it." Eliam's small hand reached across the table and rested on Jonathan's arm. "Mom said people only change when love reaches them," he repeated softly. "I think it just reached you." That night, Jonathan knelt alone in his penthouse. He couldn't remember the last time he'd prayed. Childhood, maybe. Before cynicism and ambition had convinced him that God was a fairy tale for people too weak to face reality. But now, on his knees on the cold hardwood floor, Jonathan Hale prayed for the first time in decades. "God," his voice cracked in the empty room, "I don't even know if you're listening. I don't know if I have any right to ask. But I'm asking anyway. Forgive me for what I've become, for what I've done, for the people I've hurt. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. Please, show me how." The silence that followed felt thick with presence. And then sleep took him, right there on the floor. The dream came immediately. Naomi stood in his penthouse now, looking out at the city lights with an expression of profound sadness. "You see all this?" she gestured to the skyline. "And you think it's yours? But nothing belongs to us, Jonathan. We're just stewards. And one day, we have to answer for what we did with what we were given." Jonathan fell to his knees before her. "Tell me what to do. Please. I'll do anything." Naomi turned to him, and for the first time, she smiled. "Help the ones who cannot help themselves. Be the bridge, not the wall. Use what you have to lift others up, not keep them down. It's not too late. It's never too late when the heart finally breaks open." She began to fade, her form dissolving into light. "Wait," Jonathan called out. "Will I see you again?" Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "You'll see me in every person you help, every life you change, every heart you soften. That's how love travels, Jonathan. That's how prayer works." Jonathan woke on his penthouse floor as dawn broke over the city. But he wasn't the same man who'd fallen asleep. Something fundamental had shifted. The cage of his wealth had finally cracked open. And for the first time in 30 years, Jonathan Hale felt free. He stood, walked to his window, and looked out at the city with new eyes. There was work to do. lives to restore, wrongs to make right, and he was finally ready to begin. The boardroom had never been so silent. 15 executives sat around the polished mahogany table, their faces ranging from confused to terrified as Jonathan Hale stood at the head, Margaret Chen's audit report projected on the screen behind him. "Gentlemen, ladies." Jonathan's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. A different kind of strength than the arrogance they were used to. "What you're looking at is a comprehensive audit of our lending and account management practices. What you're looking at is evidence of systematic exploitation of our most vulnerable clients." David Morrison, VP of Lending, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, everything we've done is within legal parameters. The contracts are clear. If clients don't read the terms, that's not our responsibility." "You're fired, David." The room froze. "Sir, you can't just—" "I can. And I am. You're fired. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Jonathan's gaze moved around the table. Anyone else who participated in designing, implementing, or profiting from predatory lending practices, you have until end of business today to resign. If you don't, I'll fire you publicly and ensure every media outlet in the city knows exactly why. 3 more executives stood and left without a word. "For those of you remaining," Jonathan continued, his voice softer now, "understand this. Everything changes as of today. We are refunding every hidden fee charged to accounts below the poverty line for the last 5 years. We are canceling every predatory loan and restructuring them at 0 interest. We are creating a fund to compensate families who lost their homes due to our practices." The CFO, Thomas Wright, a man who'd been with the company for 20 years, spoke carefully. "Sir, with all respect, do you understand what this will cost? We're talking about potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. The shareholders will—" "I don't care what the shareholders think, Thomas. I care about what's right. And if they have a problem with it, they can vote me out. But until they do, this is my bank, and we're going to start acting like we have souls." The announcement went public the next day. The financial press exploded. Analysts predicted the company's collapse. Competitors circled like sharks. Shareholders threatened lawsuits. But Jonathan didn't waver. He held a press conference on the steps of Hale Financial Group headquarters. Cameras from every major network pointed at him like weapons. "I'm here today to announce fundamental reforms to how this institution operates," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "For too long, we've prioritized profit over people. We've treated the struggling as opportunities for exploitation, rather than neighbors deserving of dignity. That ends now." He outlined every change, every refund, every loan forgiveness, every policy reform. "And finally," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm announcing the creation of the Naomi Brooks Initiative, a permanent program dedicated to financial education, interest-free loans, and support services for single mothers, low-income families, and anyone who needs a hand up instead of a hand out." A reporter called out from the crowd, "Mr. Hale, who was Naomi Brooks?" Jonathan smiled, and for the first time in decades, it reached his eyes. "She was a woman who changed my life without ever meeting me. She was a caregiver, a mother, a prayer warrior who believed that faith could move mountains. She had almost nothing by the world's standards, but she had everything that matters. And it's time we started measuring wealth the way she did." The Naomi Brooks Initiative launched 6 weeks later. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was held in a renovated community center on the east side of the city, the same neighborhood where Naomi had lived and worked. The place was packed. Single mothers who'd had their debts forgiven, families who'd received refunds that kept them from eviction, people who'd been shown, many for the first time, that someone with power actually cared about their struggles. And standing next to Jonathan at the ribbon, wearing new clothes but the same humble expression, was Eliam Brooks. The boy had become a regular presence at the bank, not just for trust fund paperwork, but because Jonathan had asked him to be, had asked him to remind everyone who walked through those marble halls what they were really working for. Eliam became a symbol, When executives got too focused on quarterly earnings, someone would mention the Brooks boy. When policies were debated, someone would ask, what would Eliam's mother think? The culture was changing, slowly, painfully, but genuinely. Jonathan and Eliam spent hours together. The millionaire and the boy who'd humbled him. Sometimes they talked about finance. Sometimes about faith. Sometimes they just sat in silence, Eliam doing homework while Jonathan worked. Both of them finding comfort in the presence of someone who understood that wealth and poverty were just masks people wore, and beneath them, everyone was searching for the same thing: love, purpose, hope. One afternoon, Eliam looked up from his math textbook. "Mr. Hale, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you have kids?" Jonathan's face tightened. It was a wound he'd avoided touching for years. "I have a son, Michael. He's 28 now. We don't talk anymore." "Why not?" "Because I was a terrible father. I chose work over him, money over relationship. By the time he graduated high school, he wanted nothing to do with me. I don't blame him." Eliam was quiet for a moment. "Mom used to say, it's never too late to say sorry. Not as long as someone's still breathing." The words haunted Jonathan for days, until finally, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but hadn't called in 5 years. 3 rings, 4. He almost hung up. "Hello?" Jonathan's throat closed at the sound of his son's voice. "Michael, it's your father." Silence. "I know I have no right to call. I know I don't deserve your time. But I need to tell you something. I'm sorry. For everything. For missing your childhood. For choosing work over you. For being the kind of father who taught you what success looks like but never showed you what love feels like. I'm sorry. And I know that doesn't fix anything. But I needed you to hear it." More silence. Then, quietly, "Why now? After all these years, why now?" "Because a 10-year-old boy taught me what I should have learned from you. That the only thing that matters in this life is how we love each other. And I failed you, Michael. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be the father I should have been. Even if it's too late. Even if all I can do is say I'm sorry." He heard his son's breath catch, heard the sound of tears being fought back. "I'm in Portland," Michael said finally. "I could fly out next weekend. If you want." Jonathan closed his eyes, gratitude flooding through him. "I'd like that very much." They met at a small cafe, neutral ground, both of them nervous as strangers. The conversation was stilted at first. Careful. Years of hurt don't dissolve in an afternoon. But by the end of that first meeting, they'd scheduled another, and another after that. Slowly, painfully, the bridge began to rebuild. Michael told him about his life, his job as a social worker, his wife, the grandchild Jonathan had never met. Jonathan told him about Eliam, about Naomi, about the dreams that had shattered his world and rebuilt it into something better. And one evening, over dinner, Jonathan looked at his son and said the words he should have said decades ago. "I'm proud of you. Not for what you've accomplished, just for who you are. I'm proud to be your father." Michael cried. Jonathan cried. And something broken finally began to heal. 6 months after that first day in the lobby, Jonathan stood once again at the terminal where it had all begun. The bank looked different now. Same marble, same chandeliers, but warmer somehow. The staff smiled more. Clients from every background walked through those doors. Children no longer looked out of place. Jonathan pulled up the account management screen, his fingers moving over keys he'd touched 1,000 times. But this time, he wasn't checking numbers. He was checking himself. "What's my balance now?" he whispered to no one and everyone. Not the balance in his accounts. Those numbers still existed, still substantial, but they meant less now. The real balance was measured differently. Families helped. Lives changed. Debts forgiven. Hope restored. A son reconciled. A boy mentored. A dead woman's prayers answered through the transformation of a man who'd needed saving more than anyone realized. Jonathan thought about Naomi Brooks, the woman he'd never met, but who'd changed everything. She'd died with almost nothing, but she'd left a legacy that would ripple through generations. The richest life is the one that lifts others. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Eliam approaching, a backpack slung over his shoulder. The boy smiled, that pure, uncomplicated expression that still made Jonathan's chest ache with gratitude. "Mr. Hale, I brought you something." Eliam reached into his backpack and pulled out the crumpled prayer, the same one he'd been holding that first day, the paper that had started everything. "I want you to keep this," Liam said softly. "Mom would want you to have it, to remember." Jonathan took the paper with trembling hands. The same prayer he'd read months ago, but now every word carried weight beyond measure. He folded it carefully, reverently. No longer trash, but treasure. The most valuable thing he'd ever held. "Thank you," Jonathan whispered, "for everything. For walking through those doors. For showing me what I'd become. For giving me a chance to be better." Eliam smiled. "Mom used to say, God never wastes a hurt. He just uses it to heal something bigger." They stood together in the lobby, the millionaire and the boy, as afternoon light poured through the glass walls and painted everything gold. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that in this building, something miraculous had happened. A hard heart had cracked open, a cage had become a cathedral, and a prayer whispered by a dying woman had reached across death itself to save a man who'd thought he needed no saving. Jonathan looked around the lobby, seeing it with new eyes, seeing the people, not the prophets, seeing the purpose, not the power. This was his balance now, and for the first time in his life, it was finally, beautifully, perfectly, in the black.